Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs and this is my review of the Sony FE 20-70mm f4G, a general purpose zoom lens for Sony mirrorless cameras. Announced in January 2023 and costing around $1,100, it widens the range from typical 24-70 models, making it more attractive to vloggers or anyone who wants to capture large views. Now, it's not the first general purpose zoom lens to reach 20mm at the wide end. Panasonic introduced a 20-60 kit zoom almost 3 years earlier, albeit for L-mount bodies only, so it's not an option for Sony owners. However, towards the end of 2022, Tamron launched a 20-40mm for the Sony mount, which boasts a bright f2.8 aperture for a very reasonable $700. I have a full review on my Camera Labs website if you're interested. But the Tamron really is a wide-angle zoom only, concentrating on the shorter rather than standard focal lengths, so it's more of an alternative to, say, a 16-35 than a true general-purpose lens. In contrast, Sony's 20-70 may be a stop slower and more expensive, but it's reaching almost twice as far at the long end, and that makes it more of a lens that you could leave on your camera most of the time for general use. And here's that full 20-70 range in practice on a full-frame A7 IV body, capturing huge views at the wide end before zooming into details at the long end. This makes it great for urban and natural landscapes, and it's also perfect for people too, whether you're exploiting the wide end for handheld vlogging or shooting portraits or perhaps presentations with the shallow depth of field effects at the longer end. For this review, I tested a production-ready sample of the lens, and I'm going to show you everything that it can do. Now, this isn't a sponsored video, so if you enjoy my reviews, find them useful, and would like to support my work, please do consider giving it a like and my channel a follow. Thanks a lot. The new 20-70 f4G is arguably the successor to the old Zeiss-branded 24-70 f4ZA, maintaining its constant aperture, but widening its coverage and modernising its autofocus, albeit losing the optical stabilisation. Here's the old 24-70 ZA on the left and the new 20-70G on the right, where you can see the latter lens is actually a fraction larger. Measuring 79 by 99mm and weighing 488 grams, it's 6mm wider, 4mm longer and 62 grams heavier than the old model, but once mounted on a body and in your hands, you're unlikely to notice any real difference in size and weight. Here they are when both zoomed to 70mm. Now, while the old Zeiss lens simply had a zoom and focusing ring, the new 20-70 is packed with the controls of other modern Sony lenses. So, starting at the lens mount, there's a manual aperture ring from f4 to f22 with the option to declick for smoother and silent video work and a lockable A position for body-based aperture control. The first ring operates the zoom, smoothly extending the barrel by around 40mm when set to the longest focal length. Next is a switch for auto and manual focus and a pair of customizable focus hold buttons, one on the side and the other on the top for use in the portrait orientation. And finally, a very smooth and freely spinning manual focusing ring with linear response. At the end of the barrel is a 72mm filter thread, and Sony supplies a petal hood that twists on with a bayonet mount. Meanwhile, at the other end of the barrel is a rubber grommet, with Sony describing the lens as being dust and moisture resistant. Optically, the new lens employs 13 groups and 16 elements, has a 9-blade diaphragm system, and focuses down to 30cm with autofocus or 25 in manual, and that will deliver up to 0.3 times magnification. Again, unlike the older Zeiss 24-70, the new zoom does not feature optical stabilisation of its own. It instead relies entirely on body-based systems to iron out any wobbles. Now, that minimum focusing distance of the 20-70 may be fine for close-ups with the lens set to 70mm, but it's a bit modest when used at the wide end of the range. So, if you're filming product presentation videos at around 20-24mm, where you're in the frame and holding small objects up to the camera, you may be better off with a lens that can focus closer. To be fair, it is actually a little bit better than the 24-105 f4G in this regard, but if you need smaller objects to fill more of the frame when set to the wide end of the lens, you should be looking for a model that can focus down to around 15 to 20 centimeters. Sony's 21.8 fares better, focusing down to 19 centimeters, while the Tamron 20-40 will allow you to get even closer at 17 centimeters, and every single centimeter makes a big difference to the size of the subject on the frame. Alternatively, just film your piece to camera at wide angle, like I'm doing here, before capturing separate B-roll close-ups with the lens zoomed to 70mm. That'll work just fine. Moving on, like most modern mirrorless lenses, the 20-70 exploits software profiles to compensate for geometric distortion, and these are applied as standard for JPEG. Depending on your RAW converter though, you may be able to disable the profile and take a peek at how much correction is taking place. I photographed this view at 20mm in RAW plus JPEG mode, and as I toggle between these two files, you can see how the uncorrected RAW file reveals some geometric distortion, as well as a fraction of the imaging circle being visible in the corners, before the profile drags it all back into shape on the standard JPEG. Now there's a little loss in coverage, but what you end up with is still the same as other 20mm lenses, so you're not actually missing out. Meanwhile, at the long end of the range, there's less wrangling taking place, but still some correction to the geometry. Now I personally like to show what's going on behind the scenes out of interest, but for lenses like these, it's really an academic process since the profiles are applied automatically for in-camera JPEGs, and they should also be available for most RAW converters too, so you're actually unlikely to ever see the uncorrected versions, but I do like to share them with you nonetheless. To test the optical quality for distant landscape subjects, I've photographed Brighton Pier from around 140 meters away, and I've angled the view so that details run into the corners. I'm starting here with the lens at 20mm f4, and taking a closer look in the middle, where I've focused this image, shows the usual crisp details of a modern Sony lens. I've absolutely no complaints here, and there's also no benefit to stopping down in terms of detail. Heading into the corner shows the detail becoming a tad less defined, but really only in the extremes, and I'd say it's nothing to be concerned about. There is some corner darkening due to vignetting at the maximum aperture, but this quickly reduces if you can close it down a bit. Here's the view at the other end of the range at 70mm f4, again focused in the middle of the image in order to judge field flatness. Obviously, if your main subject is in the corner or any other part of the frame, you'd be focusing there instead. Taking a closer look in the middle of the frame again reveals those crisp details straight out of the gate at the maximum aperture, and I measured little to no benefit to sharpness when stopping down, at least in the middle of the frame. Heading into the corner though reveals some softening to the ultimate detail, as well as some darkening due to vignetting. Closing the aperture just one stop to f5.6 greatly improves both respects, sharpening the corner details and lifting that darkness, and closing one stop further can provide even more improvements. So while the detail at 70mm in the middle of the frame, or indeed wherever you've actually focused the lens, is excellent at f4, if you want to maintain that sharpness across the entire frame, I would recommend stopping the aperture down at least to f5.6. Now let's take a closer look at the opportunities for blurring in the background, starting with a portrait shot at 70mm f4. Like the Zeiss lens before it, you're not going to get a hugely blurred background at 70mm f4, but there's still some opportunity for subject separation, and the rendering here looks pretty well behaved, with no distracting busyness. As you'd hope, there's also very crisp details on the subject itself. To examine the rendering in more detail, here's my ornament test at 70mm f4 near to its minimum focusing distance of about 30cm. This in turn has produced some pretty large bokeh blobs. Look closely and you'll notice some faint onion ring textures within some of the blobs, which isn't ideal rendering, but it's not too distracting and also not unusual for zoom lenses in this class. To avoid or reduce this, you'd either need to spend more on a higher end zoom like the 24-70 G Master 2 or use a prime lens instead. As I close the aperture, one stop at a time, you'll see the outer blobs become more rounded, albeit as usual taking on the shape of the 9-bladed diaphragm system, which becomes more obvious at the smallest apertures. While I wouldn't describe the rendering style as anything particular to write home about, the lens will take reasonable close-up shots when zoomed to 70mm, and I'll have more examples for you later in the review. If you're chasing diffraction spikes, here's an example of what you'll see at 20mm with the aperture closed to f22. Now the conditions were a little hazy here, so they're not the sharpest spikes you could get, but it's still a fair result for a zoom. Now let's take a look at focusing, starting with single autofocus and a single area at 70mm f4 on the A7 IV body. Sony's employed two of their XD linear motors here, claiming faster performance than the old Zeiss lens, and the focusing is certainly very quick in this test. The modern motors also promise smooth and quiet video focusing, so here's the same test filmed in 4K where the result looks pretty good and the motors were essentially inaudible. Sticking with video autofocus, here's a couple of examples of face tracking with the lens, again at 70mm f4, which not only shows Sony's prowess at this sort of thing, but also the potential for background blurring. While the longer end of the zoom range can be good for presenting pieces to camera from a tripod, many video creators will be understandably more excited about the opportunities at the shorter end of the range. So for starters, here's that outdoor setup again, but this time filmed at 20mm. Now, like all wide-angle lenses, you have to be careful about distortion, especially if your face is positioned towards the edges of the frame, but there's certainly no arguing with the broad coverage. As an interesting side note, filming with very wide-angle lenses also provides greater flexibility for making vertical crops later on for use on multiple platforms. That said, it would be even better if Sony equipped its cameras with open gate modes that recorded the full height of the sensor to start with. But that's really a complaint about their bodies, not the fault of this particular lens. Now for some vlogging tests, as this will undoubtedly be one of the popular applications for this lens. I'm going to start with a coverage comparison to illustrate how big a deal 20mm is for handheld pieces to camera versus longer lenses. So let's start with the lens set to 28mm, held at arm's length and using IBIS alone for stabilisation. Now, while you could hold the camera out a little further when one-handed, 28mm really is too long for handheld vlogging. So next, here's the lens adjusted to 24mm, arguably the longest focal length that most of us would consider for handheld vlogging. It's still verging on being a bit too tight though, especially when held with both hands, and it becomes even tighter if you're applying extra digital stabilisation, and that's a crucial thing to consider. So now here's the zoom at its widest coverage of 20mm, again with IBIS alone, so this is the full uncropped view. Now I've become a much more reasonable size on the frame, with more of my surroundings visible for context. Crucially though, it's now also wide enough to accommodate the crop of digital stabilisation without too much compromise. So here's a clip filmed again at 20mm, but this time with Sony's active stabilisation working alongside standard IBIS on the A7 IV. Now, active stabilisation applies a crop, so the field of view here has become more like 22 to 24 equivalent, but crucially it's still wide enough for handheld vlogging, while also enjoying the benefit of reduced camera shake. Let's now see it all working together while walking, starting at 20mm with no stabilisation at all, where the view is understandably wobbly, so we'll move on. Next for the 20mm with IBIS alone, so this is sensor shift stabilisation only. I find this can be pretty effective at ironing out the wobbles, but can result in some warping towards the edges. Your mileage may vary. So now here's the result with both IBIS and active stabilisation, obviously incurring that mild crop you saw earlier, but still delivering suitable coverage for handheld vlogging with the benefit of improved stabilisation. In fact, I can just about hold the camera out in one hand and still keep the image reasonably steady, and of course you may be way better at this than I am. Let's return to the start of that clip again and note that it was filmed at the maximum aperture of f4, which is obviously only going to mildly blur this background. So now let's switch to Sony's earlier 20mm f1.8 prime lens, open to f1.8 here, and again filmed with active stabilisation. This is a popular choice of vloggers who love the wide coverage but desire greater background blur, with the added benefit of also being able to film at lower ISOs too. Here they are side by side with the 20-70 at 20mm f4 on the left and the 20mm 1.8 prime on the right at 1.8, and both with active stabilisation on the A7 IV. The latter comes in a little cheaper at around $900, but obviously you're trading the flexibility of a zoom range for that brighter aperture. Which would you prefer? And before my final verdict, one more test, this time for focus breathing. Here's the lens at 20mm manually focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again. Notice how the field of view actually broadens when focused close, like I'm zooming to a wider angle, which could be distracting in something like a product presentation video. Next, here it is at 70mm, where the lens is far better behaved when focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again. There's a minor variation in magnification, but nothing that you'd really notice in real life. But the latest Sony bodies feature compensation for focus breathing, so here's that test again at 20mm with the standard version on the left, and one with breathing compensation enabled from the A7 IV on the right. Notice how the latter shows much less change in magnification as the lens is focused across the same range. Obviously it's doing this by cropping the image to maintain the coverage at closer focusing, but this does at least mean the lens will deliver much the same field of view that it would at infinity, due to the way the optics are designed. As such, I'd say it's worth enabling the feature if you're making those wide-angle product presentation videos. Which now brings me to my final verdict, during which I'll show you a selection of images that I shot with the lens on a Sony a7 IV body. As always, you can access some of the original images via my review page for the lens at cameralabs.com if you'd like a closer look. The Sony FE 20-70mm f4G is a compelling general purpose lens for owners of Sony mirrorless cameras who value extra wide coverage. It takes the classic 24-70 range of models like the previous Zeiss F4, but widens it at the short end, making it not just ideal for capturing larger views, but also more suitable for the needs of video creators. Vloggers in particular will appreciate being able to apply active stabilization and still end up with a wide field of view even after the digital crop. The optical quality is decent, with the aperture wide open, sharp across the frame at the wide end, and only a tad soft in the corners at 70mm, but this can be greatly improved at f5.6. The minimum focusing allows reasonable close-ups when set to 70mm, albeit less so at the wide end. The focusing is fast and quiet, and while there's some breathing at 20mm, it can be corrected by the latest bodies without reducing the field of view. With so many options now for Sony owners, you have to carefully think about the range, aperture and price that best suits your needs. If you're satisfied by 24mm at the wide end, but prefer more reach at the telephoto, then consider the 24-105 f4G, which also includes optical stabilization, albeit being 50% heavier, not focusing as close, and costing a little more too. Alternatively, if you're after the best quality general purpose zoom, I'd say the 24-70 G Master 2 is still the one to beat, but it's really in a different class, costing double the 20-70, plus it won't zoom as wide. If you've decided that 20mm is right for you, but you're happy to trade reach for a brighter aperture, how about Tamron's 20-40 2.8, which is also lighter, cheaper, and focuses closer? And if you love 20mm so much that you don't need to zoom the lens at all, then strongly consider Sony's 1.8 prime, providing even shallower depth of field effects, and again both lighter and cheaper than the zoom. But if you're after the flexibility of a general purpose zoom, the 20-70 f4G becomes a key contender, taking you from short tele for portraits and details to wider than average coverage that's perfect for video or dramatic views. Range is of course a personal choice, but as a fan of wider angles, I'd now choose the 20-70 over the 24-105 as my walk-around lens for a full-frame Sony mirrorless camera. P.S. Sony's also made a very early announcement that it's planning a 300mm 2.8 G Master for early 2024, presumably in time for the Olympics. I wonder if a new sports body will be joining it. And that's it for this lens review. As always, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, and if you found any of it useful, please do consider giving it a like and following my channel, because those 2 clicks really do help me make these videos for you. And if you're feeling extra generous, you could always treat me to a coffee, or perhaps treat yourself to a Camera Labs t-shirt or a copy of my in-camera photography book. There's links to everything in the description below, including the latest US and UK pricing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.